Hey everybody, welcome to Leon's Chainsaw Parts and Repair. We are looking at a Super XL-925 for Hal. He picked this saw up locally, and it has it's seen some action. See, the starter cover's got a pretty good wowza in it right here. Still functions though, so we're going to deal with some other issues the saw has first. Big old crack out of some sort up here by the oil cap. So that's where we're going to start this project, is replacing this tank and crankcase. And along the way we're going to put a new piston in. This has some carbon scoring that we'll take a look at. It's caused some scratches on the piston, but the rings don't appear to be damaged. So that's giving me hope that the cylinder is in good shape, which means throwing a piston in there should make this thing run like a top. And I actually pulled pretty good compression off of it, even with the scoring that I see on the pistons. So I'm hoping that that means this project will go smoothly for Hal. So anyway, let's get started tearing it down. I don't know that I've got a video out there of a 925 being torn down, but pretty much anything from an XL-700 to a 925 is going to be about the same. Okay, so the air filter cover is a little bit damaged. We might be able to bend this landing here back into shape and utilize it. The knob's pulled all the way through, so I don't know if the ring was installed improperly or what. We'll worry about that later. That's the least of our problems right now. This is wet because I just hosed it down pretty good. Since we're going to be tearing into engine components, I don't want a ton of grease and crap everywhere. So let's go ahead and get the starter. Looking at the starter, trying to say carburetor. Let's get the carburetor off. So just pull your cotter pin. And if you're careful with that, usually you can reuse it a couple times. That is going to be my hope here. And this had a bad air filter at some point. I see plenty of evidence down in here of that. The air filter mount and deflector comes off with just one screw here. The carburetor bolts are like a lot of other Homelites. They're a 5/16. And you need a box open end wrench combo to get these things going. That one's been rounded a little bit, so yeah, that's great. Lots of guys weren't very nice to these things. I'll see if I can replace that bolt on reassembly. Nothing like having to put vice grips on your your saw to work on it. Try and keep everything in frame here. So Hal bought this at a local thrift shop, and I think he did all right on the price, even with what we're doing to it. Some of it doesn't. It's probably not essential. I mean, it would run with the piston the way it is, but he doesn't want to have to worry about it. He wants it right. I certainly don't blame him there. That fuel line was spongier than spongy, so I just went ahead and cut it. I mean, I'm cutting it with my fingernail. That's some goopy nasty right there. But anyway, he got it home and he did have it running. So that's how we know the fundamentals are good on this thing. Alright, let's get the starter out of the way so that we can get to the bolts for the throttle chamber there. And we'll see how bad this thing is. Hal decided we'd tackle the worst stuff first, and then down the road he figures he can do some of the body parts like the starter. It's had some welding done on it. This bracket's welded. You can see this handle is done, but they look pretty decent. Whoever was welding this stuff knew enough to be able to weld magnesium and make it come out fairly strong. We'll replace the handle bracket as we go, but the throttle chamber at this point, Hal is fine with having it stay. angle is pretty crummy there. The handle's got to come off anyway, but I think we popped this loose enough to... Nope, we sure didn't. Alright, well, I take that back. We'll get the handle off. These are an Allen head, especially on the bottom side. Oh yeah. Boy, that handle's under pressure. That might have gotten a little wowzer in it too, but it still looks good. When you're dealing with these Allen head screws, especially on the bottom of the chainsaw, you want to make damn certain you get enough of the goop out of the threads, or not threads, excuse me, out of the head, so that your Allen wrench is seated well. Alright, down here, these are flathead. Those weren't super tight at all. These have a kind of a quasi anti-vibration system on it. On the bottom here, these shoulder screws go through a rubber pad, and then there's a steel plate behind it. Gives it just a little bit of movement, which is designed to be the AV. There's that rubber piece. Looks pretty good, actually. I like that. There's our steel piece. Any of that missing, and you're going to have all kinds of slop in this handlebar. Slop that you don't want to have there. Must have still been some oil in that. Puking on the bench. Unacceptable. Okay, now with that handle out of the way, we can finish getting this starter removed. I guess I set that a little bit low. These saws are not difficult to work on, but there's a sequence you got to go through. What assembles to what? Okay, well, we've got a little more cleanup work to do here. Okay. Flywheel looks good, starter pawls, all that stuff is good. It's a good sign. Alright, so these carburetor chamber screws are a pain. Don't ever let anybody tell you they aren't, because they are. Especially if they have an overabundance of Loctite on them. You can get a socket on these upper ones, but it's not easy. I may not have enough play. There we go. That very lower one down there, you pretty much have got to be able to break it loose and then get a long flat blade screwdriver and come in through the choke hole. That gives you your best line on it. If you try and come in from the top, you're at a janky angle. You might get it loose, but you also might just tear it up. And I'm not a big fan of just tearing it up. Okay. If you can at least get it loose, this angle isn't nearly as bad, but I've had some that I've had to break loose through the choke hole right there, so. There should be one more. Way down low. But I'm going to hold off a minute before I take that loose. We've got these clamps on these oil lines, and at least this one I think I'm going to want to leave behind. It's either that or we take the clutch off now and come in. There's more than one way you can tackle this. Maybe we'll do that. Get the clutch out of the way and we'll take this off. There'll be less disassembly. So these clutch cover screws have a washer that has a slight concave to it. You want to keep that in the proper sequence as you put it back on. You want it to compress against that clutch plate. These were known for rattling out and then cutting a hole in your drive case cover out here. We've all seen those. So these also get some Loctite blue on the way back in. Alright, that is the 6-shoe clutch. So we'll get our tool here. And because I've got some cool stuff in the way of original Homelite tools, I have this combo flywheel puller and holder. So I'm going to thread that right onto the starter excuse me, pawl studs. And what this will allow me to do is hold this thing in place with the bottom of the crankcase here as I'm taking that clutch loose. There we go. As much as possible, I like to avoid using a rattle gun on these. I've broken too many pins doing that. And it's not like Homelite parts are growing on trees these days. There's less and less of them. So we'll stick with the breaker bar. And remember, these are reverse thread clutch. But these holes can wear. Oh, you bastard. Don't move on me. Come on. Try that again. Jeez, son of a gun. I wanted to support that other side, but there we go. Slow and steady. If you don't have that fancy tool that I've got on the flywheel, the way to safely hold the piston is take your spark plug out and jam 16 to 24 inches of starter rope in there as it's coming up on compression. You want to get it high enough that it's past the muffler port. You don't want rope squirting out of there, and then as you compress it can get wedged in there. Bad news. But get it up just past the muffler port, fill it full, and as you start to tighten, it compresses on that rope, and it's a safe way to hold the piston. And I can already see one. Somebody's been into this before. The thrust washer that's supposed to be on the oil pump worm gear is missing, and there's a nice little bit of grooving on that. I don't think it's damaged per se, but we'll definitely get a washer in there on reassembly. Alright, now we can see that oil line. Hopefully I can get to it without taking this out of the vise. I haven't been lucky in anything else that I've done today, so why would I be lucky on this? Let's shove it back a little bit here. This is in the bar adjuster. There we go. That'll do it. So far out of the saws I've worked on today, we've had a carburetor inlet needle that I couldn't repair because I don't have it in stock. That'll be the easiest one. We've had a bad piston and potentially damaged cylinder on one of the hardest to find saws. So I'm really counting on Hal's 925 here to be the good news story of the day. We won't finish this today, but if I can at least get the teardown complete, I'd feel a lot better about that. And it's still just tight enough, but I can't use my hand to pull that down. There we go. Okay. Disengage that. Nothing like contents under pressure. There we go. Alright. That's the lower one. I think we can get away with this. I've got so many saws torn apart, I like to try and avoid situations where I mix parts up. Finally had to clean this workbench. That abomination was just shit. Sunday yesterday, we kind of had a little picnic with my buddy and the neighbors and all that. Smoked a big old brisket. And while I was smelling that thing cook, I was in here trying to clean this mess up. Okay. Last screw. So, get the spark plug out of the way just on principle so we don't have to fight around it. Alright, what else are we going to come to? The stop switch wire. Can break that loose later. So there's a gasket right back here that you kind of got to break loose. That'll be it. There it goes. And by break, I do mean just that. You're not going to save it. I guarantee that. So if you got to take this air box off, get this stop switch wire to come loose. If you got to take the air box off, plan on that gasket. If you can't find one, you can probably substitute some good RTV, but just plan on doing something. There we go. Spark plug wire is still in its little clip here. It doesn't want to come out. There we go. There's another greasy mess of a part to be cleaned up. I'll worry about that later. Okay. Now normally, if we were just doing piston replacement and reusing this crankcase, we'd be on the home stretch, but since we're not, let's go ahead and get this flywheel off. So again, I've got the neat Homelite tool, and I'm sure I'll get a ton of questions about where that came from. Just got it in a box of parts years ago. They're not that common. Every once in a while there's one out on eBay, but the collector guys like myself tend to pick those up pretty quick. Most of the time, what you're going to end up doing is having to buy one of the generic kits that the guy out of Marysville, Washington sells, where you pull these studs completely out, and then you've got the steel plate. You put a couple screws in from the top, and you got your jack screw, and pop it off like that. But I have this tool, so therefore I am going to use it, as it does make life a little bit easier. And again, if I don't have to take pawls out, that's less stuff to keep track of. So again, this tool a little quicker. Come on, you. Having the right tool is really essential, or at least a proper flywheel puller. There's always the old trick of a wood block and a rubber mallet, which can damage the magnet. I mean, most of the time you don't, but I have seen it where it does damage it. But even if you were to take this coil out of the way, you still got the legs in the way there, you're going to play hell getting this thing off without a puller of some sort. Let's see how tight she is. She's very tight. There we go. You don't need the BFH, just a little hammer. I'd say 1 out of every 50 that I do is a disaster. Just stuck in place, and if you can't get it doing what I just did, and maybe a little bit harder, I would say stop. Soak the damn thing with penetrating oil. Let it sit overnight if you have to. And then if that doesn't work, do some strategic heating. I mean, be careful. Don't melt an aluminum flywheel or light a magnesium case on fire. But yeah, you gotta treat this stuff like it is. It's old parts that are made to last, but after a while they have their issues. Okay. So on these things, the ignition and the back plate to the ignition, that back plate is the crankcase cover. So we need to get these 3 screws and this guy out on the end out of there. And then get that thing pried off without breaking anything. That is really the key. Okay, these bolts under here are a 1/4 and they got a 7/16 head. Going slow because those do have Loctite on them, and after all these years, I want to break some of that crap loose. You guys have seen me drill out crankcases. It's not fun. I would much rather spend my time repairing one of these things for the right reasons. Now, this thing is a gooped up mess, but we should be able to catch underneath the bracket and just ever so slightly start working it up. There are index pins that it's sitting on, so that'll kind of give you a gauge of whether it's moving or not. Oh, that came off easy. I got lucky there. They're not always that easy, trust me. So the crankshaft seal is sandwiched behind the bearing there. So to replace that, we got to take this module off. I'm not going to deal with that right now. I'm going to clean this up and we'll do that on reassembly. But more and more, I'm getting gun shy about doing one of these projects without replacing the crankshaft seals because it seems to be biting more and more. I even have a saw that I shipped back Midwest. Damn thing, I test ran it more times trying to make it perfect. And it ran great for me here. There's videos out there of it cutting up on the firewood hill and everything. Sat in a box for about 3 months before it got shipped back to dude. fired it up, and he said every time he tilts it or turns it on its side, the thing dies. And it never would do that for me. It was fine when I boxed it up. But somehow, magically, those crank seals decided to take or at least one of them, decided to take a dive. I've got this kind of down to an art where I can replace them on the, well, replace it with the saw assembled in almost all cases. I can get the old, that's great. Hold the cylinder stud right out. Wow. Well, that happens, but not very often. Anyway, I can replace those crank seals on the saw in most cases. This one is one that would not be the case, at least not on this flywheel side, because of that ignition module in the way. So those ones are almost a no-brainer to just do it and get it over with. Yeah, that saw I sent back there to Scott for his buddy just pisses me off. He was real clear that this guy wants a reliable saw, and the Super EZ is a super reliable saw. Test ran it, let it sit, test ran it after like 2 months, took it out, cut again. Started fine, ran great, idled good, cut strong. But I had no reason to think the crank seals were bad, so I didn't replace them. So now, on his next shipment of saws, coming in for repair, that one will be included, and I'll get to do those crank seals. Then again, moral of the story. Sometimes it's better to just do it first time, whether you think it needs it or not. There are aftermarket, well, current production seals that replace an awful lot of the old Homelite ones. Not all of them, but the Super 2, Super EZ ones, those are available. I think the SKF number is 4913. So, if you see some clown on eBay trying to charge 15 or 20 bucks for a seal, don't buy it. Just go out there and find somebody who sells SKF and buy them there. Alright, so we've come to our first unexpected wahoo. The worm gear is seized to the crankshaft, which is not exactly what you want. Wish I'd noticed that before I took the crankshaft, or the flywheel off. Dirty thing. Well, this is the kind of stuff you can run into when you think you're just cruising. Dirty thing. Think you're cruising along and things are going right. Oh, you ridiculous bastard. Ah, goody, goody, goody. Okay. Well, where the hell's my penetrating oil? Hopefully this is just a little rust and maybe some goop and not an actual deformity of the worm gear that's going to really make this a problem. So we'll let that sit for a minute and take the muffler off. Okay. Yeah, that scoring is ever so slight. The problem is it destroyed the ring landing on the, I don't know if you guys are going to be able to see that or not. Destroyed the ring landing on the lower ring. think that'll bring it into focus for you guys. So right through here, the aluminum's pushed up over the piston ring. This upper ring is still free. So when it was running, it was basically running on 1 2/3 rings. And this is carbon scoring. I can tell by what's been cleaned out of the muffler area of the port here already. And looking at the muffler itself, there's a ton of carbon buildup where it was leaking out. This will be assembled with a gasket when it goes back. The early ones didn't have a gasket, but they switched to that later on, and I'm going to do that here too. But anyway, this is what carbon scoring will do, and that's running your engine out of tune, running too much oil in the gas. Yeah, I said it, and I know there'll be a lot of guys that disagree, but hey, this here is living proof. That's what happened. Scoring on the muffler side is one of two things: running lean, getting hot and seizing, or carbon scoring. And a lean, hot seize, you're done. Compression's gone. Carbon scoring, it builds up over time in the muffler port and starts scratching. And it doesn't really do damage until it gets enough material moved to where it's got the ring compressed. That's when you start having problems. But even with all this crap, this thing still ran. So, anyhow, it looks like we're due for a muffler body too. Honestly, that looks, as improbable as it is, it looks like the chain derailed at some point and came back and whacked the muffler. Yeah. Alright, we're going to see if we can do something with that stupid worm gear so we can get this project moving along. What I'm going to do is slip the flywheel back on the key, get a better set of vice grips, and see if I can work that thing loose. Good news is that worm gear is not hard to find if it's bad. But we got to get it off the crankshaft to even get this thing apart, because we're definitely going to reuse the crank and the rod and all that other stuff. God, there's not much sticking out. Now, I'm going to set this so that it's not gripping that hard. I want to avoid screwing it up. Let's see what that does. That's moving. Whether it's coming off yet or not, yeah. There we go. And that worm is harder than my vice grips. There we go. So I'd say the penetrating oil did the trick there. Yeah. A little bit of rust. Not bad. A lot of gobbledygook in here. Alright. Go back to what I was working on, which is getting the cylinder off. That's our next step in this process. Thankfully, this saw, it's a lot easier to get to the... I hope that one doesn't try and spin out or we're screwed. It's easier to get to these cylinder bolts or nuts than it is on, say, a Super EZ. Some of these things you got to actually take a box end wrench and grind about 1/3 of the thickness off just to get it in here. Real pain in the neck, but I'm sure Homelite had some special wrenches that would have been sold back in the day. And that is something I have not glommed onto yet. But if I get the opportunity, be sure I will. Okay. Another nice thing about the 925 design here is the fact that the cylinder gasket and the airbox gasket are a two-piece, unlike the Super EZ where it's one. So if you tear it on the upper side and you really want it to be right, you got to pull the cylinder and fix it there. Fortunately, it's not 100% necessary. Okay, so that broke loose pretty easily. Oh wow. How? Dude, I don't know how the hell this thing was running. Wow. That upper ring is still free like we talked about. Bottom one is completely jammed up. That has got scoring all the way around it. My goodness. Jeez, I really don't know how that was running. But, other than a couple minor ridges, there's one right, clean that up a little bit, see if you guys can see it. Right through here, you can see that streak and that streak right by the intake ports here. The muffler, ironically, other than right there, yeah. I think the aftermarket piston's going to do well on this. It'll take a little while for the rings to seat in, but as long as when we get it assembled it's blowing at least 125, we'll be alright. Alright, so there's a couple ways you can deal with this next part. The one thing you can do is take the piston off now, or you can take these cap screws out and take the rod and piston as an assembly. That's what I like to do. And I've got a patented little trick if I can find my... If you take the piston off first, you've got better access to use a ratchet or something. 9 times out of 10, I'm not replacing the piston like I am this time. So I use my Allen head and a 1/4-inch wrench. Wow, it's turning hard. Normally those come right loose and then you can hand thread them out. Someone must have put Loctite on this. I've never seen a Homelite spec that calls for that. Assembled a lot of saws without it, and to the best of my knowledge they're all still running. I certainly have never had a customer call me up and say, "Hey dude, connecting rod fell off." So that's good. That's really not the kind of message a guy wants. It's a fairly basic failure. Okay. Oh yeah. Coated in Loctite. Yeah, if that is OEM, that's the first time I've seen it on a 925. Yeah, I'm going to tilt this up. A little bit. Actually a lot, so I can actually get to that. So remember, there are, what on this model is it 28 needles? I don't remember the exact count, but the rod bearing is under here and it's individual needles. So as you take this apart, the second screw, those little things are all going to drop. And you can have them drop all over your bench and on the floor, or you can get your crankcase up and let them drop into there. Now you still have risk of them coming out the front, but when I start seeing them drop, I'm going to stop. Actually, I'm going to stop right now. I'm going to put a paper towel on the front where that ignition backplate was, so that no little rogue critters come flying out. Or at least we'll minimize their velocity. It figures the saw that I'm making a video on would have that, so that we spend 3 or 4 minutes of film time on this. Yeah, there's the first one that fell out. Good Even if you're going to use Loctite, this is ridiculous. There's no reason for this much. And boom, there they go. Okay. Yeah. Get a close up of that piston. And there's our real terrible spot. But damn, it's all the way around. But somehow remarkably, that upper ring is still loose. And barely even grooved. Well, that's why she'd run. Okay. Now we're going to rotate this. Yeah, I didn't think that part through. Usually I have it loose. If I have it loose on the bench, it's super simple. So I can just tilt it forward and... What the hell? Apparently my needle nose pliers have been magnetized. Maybe that'll be useful. A small magnet of some sort is actually really good for getting these little guys out. These are all going to get cleaned up thoroughly. The last thing you want is to assemble a bearing full of some sort of gritty goo. I have no reason whatsoever to believe that the bearing or the crank are bad. Everything was within, it felt tight. I mean, felt like any other saw. So, okay. Set those safely out of the way. Alright. Yeah, even that bearing's smooth. So, I'll have to transfer to that new crankcase. Things like the intake with the reed. These oil ports, set it up with the fuel hose, the adjuster, and this crap. But I want to go through the last part of getting the crankshaft out, and this is basically the case of all, all Homelites. You've got two screws that retain the bearings. Or the bearing. They're right across from each other, and you got to rotate the crank just right so you can see them. There's a lock washer on those that goes into a groove of the crank bearing, or sorry, the crank bearing itself. The crank bearing is retained to the crank with a snap ring that you cannot see. So you've got to get those screws out, and then it comes out this way. So we are going to use the impact gun on those screws. I have found that to be far and away the most effective. Get an extension now. Trying to hold the part still and get a long screwdriver and get enough pressure on it has proven to be usually next to impossible. Just like that. That's what I'm talking about. Now, those screws typically do get a little Loctite, and that's part of why they can be a pain in the ass to get out at times. Boom. No damage. Love it. Okay. So a shop that has a press and a whole bunch of neat stuff would press that bearing out. I don't have that. What I do have is an old clutch plate. That will protect the crankshaft threads, and we're going to tap that out. I say tap. I think you guys know what I mean. Boom. Love it. Now on installing it, I'll show you that trick. We got away with that because we were hammering straight. We weren't stressing the rod journal there. If we tried to hammer it back in, that's where we could crack this and give ourselves a two-piece crankshaft, which is no good for anybody. So we'll set up a series of washers and use that clutch plate to pull it back in. And if worse comes to worse, if you ever have a really tight one, you can either freeze the bearing to shrink it a little bit or heat the case. I'd advocate freezing the bearing. Alright, so there's our two lock washers that go with those screws we just pulled out. Yeah. It's really too bad that this is jacked up. If it wasn't for that hole up top, this would be a perfectly good part to reuse. So, okay, that is it. I'm going to end the video here. God knows how long that went. I'm going to guess somewhere around 45 minutes. Just kind of feels that. But that is a 925 splatted on the bench, all but a few of these little parts, which are all pretty self-explanatory to get out. So, again, carbon scoring. I know there are guys out there that verbatim will say, the manufacturer recommended 20 to 1, I'm going to run that no matter what. You can do that, and if your saw is tuned properly, it's probably not going to have a big issue with it. But I've said it before and I'll say it again. If you pull the trigger on that saw and it's blasting a giant cloud of smoke, it's not tuned right. They should be running a heck of a lot cleaner than that. Even if you're one of the guys who's old school and swears up and down you need to run 30 weight for your mix at 20 to 1. It still shouldn't look like a mosquito fogger. If it does, you're out of tune. And if you run it long enough, you're gonna get that right there. So anyway, we'll come back for part 2 and reassemble this thing.